All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Just kind of go over, I guess, what happened the last 2 weeks. It's kind of the agenda, right? Everything that's been happening to get that initial proposal kind of through the door. Last meeting, I was talking about Consul, and that week I was working on a fix for removing Consul, at least at the invoker level. However, with Roderick's PR to nuke Consul from all of OpenWhisk, which is pretty nice, I decided not to submit anything, and I've kind of been using that PR as the starting point for the last 2 weeks. So basically what I've been doing is I wanted to prove out that without Consul, it's much easier to deploy OpenWhisk on Kubernetes. So I essentially took his PR, rebased master on it, and I did this about a week ago. And then from that, I created a bunch of Docker images and just pushed them all to my name. And with those Docker images, I was able to fully build out OpenWhisk via YAML files and deploy it, which is pretty nice. So right now, the controller and invoker should essentially mimic main OpenWhisk once the nuke Consul PR is in, and which is great because then it should be easy to just change the YAML files to not use my Docker images, but use the main OpenWhisk Docker images. But besides that, I created my own images for Kafka and another one for CouchDB. And so I'm not sure what we want to do. Can't hear you, Kavitha. I think doesn't show that you're muted, but I'm not sure if it's receiving. Still nothing. It might be easiest to chat. I don't know if you can just send it to everyone. I have no idea. All right. So until she works that out, that's kind of what I did for the last 2 weeks. And so I'm kind of happy with that. And so looking forward the next couple of weeks, my main goal is to try and figure out how I can essentially get all of the images that I've built into main OpenWhisk repo. And that way everyone can use them, and we won't have to rely on custom built images because that is kind of annoying. So that's kind of my goal for the next 2 weeks at least. Then besides that, there was there's something that's a little weird with Kafka still. I don't know if you had taken a look at it in a while, Ben. Okay, so that's just typing in the chat. She's saying the question she has is about custom images. And so, yeah, I don't care for the custom images either. However, I built them. The images are essentially what does Ansible do in its either kind of like pre or post processing. And I essentially built the logic that Ansible performs into the Docker images directly. And then she's asking, can we execute directly using kubectl commands from the shell? I'm hoping that we don't need to for the most part, because I would like it, ideally, I would like everything to be configurable via environment variables on the Docker images. And that way, any of the hard setup kind of just happens in the background and you don't have to worry about it as an admin. However, that being said, back to Kafka. So I don't know if you've taken a look at Kafka, Ben, since you had initially pointed me to your repo.
Kafka in general, or you mean?
Kafka, what they're doing. So what they've done is they've added a couple of other properties that you can kind of edit when you create topics. So they've added the ability to, what is it? You can set like byte limits for message sizes and stuff like that, and a couple other settings.
Hi, hear me now?
Hello. Yeah, now we
Yes.
can hear you.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
To finish my question on the custom images,
Mhm.
basically what I tried to do was, take all the commands from the configure.sh file and try to execute them on my, local Amazon instance. I expected that, technically everything should work that way. If I, just take the kubectl commands and then add the environment variables there that were being taken from, a Kube environment. Expected it should work, and it did work to some extent.
Mhm.
So I was wondering what was the original purpose for the custom images, because I couldn't see anything different that you might have been doing in your image.
Right. So the custom images. So I can actually just pull up the code and show you.
But there's Ansible scripts that run after booting the Docker images that exist today, and so the custom images have to encapsulate that Ansible post-deploy functionality essentially, or post-boot functionality.
So if we get rid of Ansible completely, then technically we should be able to just do with kubectl and the kube config files that carry the env.
So the goal of removing Ansible, I'm just pulling up some files right now to give you a concrete example of some things that are happening, would be to essentially move that post deploy logic into the Docker images so that everyone can essentially use the same Docker image, whether you're running in Kubernetes, Docker Compose, or something like that.
I see. So instead of giving a bunch of shell commands at the kubectl shell commands,
right.
give image. Okay.
Yeah.
The end goal would still be, at least in my mind, I think what she's asking is that ultimately there's a set of Kubernetes YAML files, and I could say kube control create and pass it, the directory of files, and it deploy OpenWhisk essentially from that directory. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking, the bottom line should be that's it, right? We shouldn't have to create, we shouldn't need to create any more images or deployment pods.
Right. The images, there will be OpenWhisk specific images. I assume that they will continue to be or be created for Kafka and Couch to be because of OpenWhisk specific things that need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
those images will be in the Kubernetes YAML files, and there'll be known published images. So you can still just have a Kubernetes YAML and say kube control create, and it'll pull those OpenWhisk specific Kafka images, from Docker Hub or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, I think at least at this point, at this stage, my goal was just to understand exactly what was happening. And for that purpose, I think I was trying to avoid pulling in any images and just try all the kubectl commands. So kind of like my question is maybe from that perspective, I agree that maybe once everything works, then, uh, there should be a published image. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So I can give you like a concrete example of what I was trying to do. So can you see my screen just fine?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this screen is for kind of what Kafka does via Ansible when it deploys. It's just kind of annoying to see because everyone's face is over it. So let me move that down. And right, if you usually run through Ansible, it kind of, right, so it just pulls the Zookeeper image and it spins up Zookeeper, and then it pulls the Kafka image, and then it starts Kafka, then it waits till it's running. And then after the Docker image is running here, it actually goes through and creates a number of topics. So for example, it'll run this Docker exec Kafka on the VM, and it essentially does this, it calls this script that's built into the Docker image with this create topic. And so it creates this health topic, and it has a bunch of parameters that get passed to it. And then there's these additional things, since the last time I looked at it, that get set, like these retention bytes and how long that topic should stick around, and these segment bytes and stuff like that. So what I've done to account for this is I've created my own Docker image, which is pretty simple. It uses the same Kafka image, the same base image that gets pulled over here, which is right here. So I just hard-coded the version in.
Okay.
And I copy essentially this little init script. And my init script, if we scroll down here, so what it does, I actually kind of looked at Ben's and what they were doing to kind of help guide me and start off. So essentially we start Kafka and just background the process. And just like this file, it waits until the server's up and running. So there's a little kind of just ping method to try and wait until it's up and running. And then I go through and I create the topics just like they get created here. But the difference, right, between them now is this is all built into the Docker image. In this way, you get this exact same behavior, but you only have to configure environment variables. And you don't need Ansible to do all this extra stuff for you.
Okay, if I can interrupt here. So basically this is exactly what I tried to do from my AWS instance, but not the Docker. Actually, I kept coming across the same crash that you mentioned, that the Kafka, it goes into that crash loop mode very often. Then when I looked at the logs, I realized that it's trying to connect to Zookeeper, and it's not able to connect. And then I noticed that the Kafka's idea of the Zookeeper host is different from the actual host ID for the Zookeeper. So that brings me to the question of, like, I saw that the host file does not define it for Zookeeper. It only defines it for the main entities like Kafka and console and other things. So
Yeah.
how it's supposed to discover the host ID for the Zookeeper? In my case, because I tried to create everything from the AWS instance, each of them are given these Docker IPs, CouchDB and all these guys. But I did not know how to pass the host ID so that the Kafka knows that this is where it should listen for it.
Right. So the way we're doing it in Kube is I've split out Zookeeper. So when they currently deploy it, Zookeeper and Kafka are side by side using these Ansible files. But for Kubernetes, I split them out just because it doesn't matter. And it seems like you would want them split out once you get into HA. So for Zookeeper, what I do is I create just a static service, right? Anyone can edit these files when they want to deploy them, but I create a service, right? So Zookeeper gets a DNS entry when it's deployed, right? And so it's got some ports exposed on it. And when Kafka tries to communicate with it, we go over here to the Kafka YAML. There's a whole bunch of environment variables that get set. And one of these, down here, is the Zookeeper info, is the Zookeeper host. And the way it would look it up in Kube is the zookeeper.openwhisk is the DNS entry that gets created.
And when does this DNS entry get registered with the Kube DNS? When you create the service?
This gets, yes. So because this YAML file is all in one, when you do a kubectl create or apply, whatever, this Zookeeper file, it'll create both of them for you. So it'll create the Zookeeper service and the Zookeeper pod.
So Zookeeper service is needed for the DNS registration, or just the pod creation is not enough to create the DNS entry?
Correct. Yeah. In Kubernetes, anytime you create a DNS entry, it's via this kind service. And this is the actual YAML for creating that service entry.
I thought as long as they are in the same namespace, they should be able to talk to each other using the container ID or the Docker, maybe not.
No. So that works if I would to take this container definition and put it in the file over here as another container, right? So if I were to put it under here, what happens, what happens in that case is both of the Docker images will then run in the same namespace, and then they can talk to each other over localhost. But if they're split out like that, you need a DNS entry for them to communicate.
So when you say localhost, you mean like 127.0.0.1 or the Docker, the main
127.0.0.1.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so anything other than 127, we have to go through the service and then the Kube DNS.
Yes. Right, because in a big cluster, we're not saying where these have to run, so they can run, across different nodes. And so they have to be able to communicate over the service and not just over localhost, unless you, right? So that's how that works.
So this is the reason why you had all those services in the configure.sh. I think you tried to explain last time. Probably I did not quite catch it.
Yeah, that's fine. I know there's a lot of concepts and things to learn about with Kube, and it's very hard to understand unless you actually start playing with it.
And is there a way to check, query the Kube DNS entries?
Yeah. So there's a command from the CLI. You can do kubectl services, and it'll list all of the top level like ports and IPs, and then you can kind of inspect them more to see which ones are bound to which pods and stuff like that.
So if you say describe service, that should show the binding.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So Let's see. So with that, I'm pretty happy with how I was able to get things deployed, other than this Kafka. Even though kind of, right, the Docker image mimics the behavior, it limits us on just being able to run kubectl, scale, invoker, because you won't get the creation of these topics, which, I mean, we can solve kind of easily in Kubernetes, but we can't solve it for other deployments that use straight Docker files. So I was kind of
So
torn on that.
basically, okay, so this is the reason why we want to keep the env at the Docker level instead of the kube config map or something.
Yes.
Okay.
At least that's what I was trying to do.
So, well, we want to make sure you can configure these with environment variables, but in Kubernetes, those environment variables get set. They could either get set in a config map or in the container definition of the Kubernetes YAML, right? That's kind of up to preference there.
I know. Unfortunately, there's a million ways to configure the same thing, which makes it a bit hard.
Right. And it's only newer Kubernetes versions. I think it's 1.6.2 and newer. I don't remember the exact version. You can actually make a config map of all your environment variables. And then in your container definition, say, use this config map as environment variables, basically. Older versions don't have that. So older versions, you either have to just manually specify them directly in each. Like I bring this up, like there's some environment variables that are common among some of
Right.
the controller and the invoker and other stuff. So ideally, we wouldn't have to specify those differently in each place. But you'd have to limit which version of Kubernetes you run on if you want to use config maps as environment variables.
Yeah. However, yeah, well, down the line, if we want to get things HA, I know I was looking at some of the documentation from Kube, and they said that with 1.7, they have HA for Kafka and stuff like that. That was in their release notes. I think stateful sets. But
Well, there are examples. If you look, I was looking at them this morning, actually. There's examples in the Kubernetes contrib Docker repo of Helm charts, but also just HA, Zookeeper, and Kafka examples using persistent volumes, using stateful sets.
Okay.
We'll want to probably look at those and pull from.
Cool.
But there's also a pull request in OpenWhisk itself to enable Kafka clusters that has not landed yet, that changes some things.
Oh, really?
Keep an eye on.
Interesting. I'll have to watch that then.
Yeah, because it allows you to then specify like a list of Kafka servers that OpenWhisk can talk to instead of a single server. And it's got some other changes. So we'll want to keep an eye on that.
Interesting.
And as far as invokers, spinning up a new invoker, with Kafka auto create topics, you can do that as long as the topics get auto created with the right replication factor and other parameters. So that's where you can't pass all these different parameters in easily.
Right.
It's basically the issue.
So that's the thing, is you can get around it, but only for Kubernetes, not through straight YAML, right? Because you could have another pod that comes up that just does, with the Kube CLI, that does an exec into the Kafka container and then runs this script with the following arguments. Right.
Well, there's also another option would be to have the invoker itself run, and the invoker have whatever the script is called, Kafka topics.sh. Right. The invoker could actually run this on its boot to ensure it's, because you can say create this topic if not exist, right? So when an invoker comes up into its image, it could say, hey, I'm invoker ID 4, ensure invoker 4 topic exists.
Interesting. Yeah. So we would have to copy this script to the invoker image.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Because I was thinking, how do we get this script? But you're totally right. We can just copy or build the script into the invoker image.
Right. It's just a pretty small shell script. So that would be another option. And I think there's also even talk, though, in OpenWhisk about there's a PR or either an issue about changing the way Kafka groups are handled. So it may be long term that each invoker may not end up having its own topic anyway. So we just have to keep an eye on all these changes as they happen in OpenWhisk, and also perhaps provide input on some of these changes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's good. All right. Good thing this is recorded. I'm going to go back and take notes after too. So cool. All right. Because then with that, right, ideally, I'd like to be like, hey, can we create some smarter Docker images? Because we can simplify everything. We can simplify things everywhere, right? We'd be able to simplify it for Kube and just using the straight Ansible deployment, which will help clean up CIs and all of that stuff. So I think it would be a win if we can start getting some of this logic in. The only problem is I'm not sure where to put it. And so I would like to work with someone from the team to be like, hey, let's build these things up.
Right. And I think it'd be receptive because, like you said, even with the OpenWhisk Ansible deployment that exists today, it could greatly simplify the steps there in Ansible if things were more baked into the images.
Yeah, I think so. So cool. So that's basically everything I have. I don't know if anyone has more questions or anything like that.
I'll have a comment. We being my team at Red Hat, we have a prototype of a Kubernetes container implementation that functionality-wise fully works, but the way we're currently shipping logs, I don't know how much we know about, when I say Kubernetes containers, currently today, even when deployed on Kubernetes, OpenWhisk talks directly to the Docker socket.
Yes.
So in our prototype, OpenWhisk no longer does that, and it talks to the Kubernetes API instead, which means that then when you're creating these function runtimes, these action runtimes, they're visible in Kubernetes as pods. They're not, because currently today they're kind of hidden behind the scenes, and you don't have any Kubernetes level visibility into any of it.
Right.
So we have a working prototype of talking to that. We have a lot of performance issues around logs that we have to deal with. Today, the logs are not shipped to a third party or anything. We have to go collect logs from each invocation of an action. And so we've got to figure that out as far as how to do that in a more performant way. Besides, right now we shut out the kube control logs, which is that's very expensive to do on every container.
Yes, that's quite.
So that's not going to work. There is a WebSocket API per pod I think we can talk to that may be more efficient there, or we may end up just trying to figure out how to get maybe a more general OpenWhisk issue of maybe shipping logs somewhere else instead of directly fetching logs from Docker containers and Kubernetes. But I just wanted to bring that up if anybody else is looking at the same, where you'd like for OpenWhisk on Kubernetes to actually talk to Kubernetes API to give Kubernetes level visibility. We'd be happy to collaborate on that to try and get that where it's a point where it's usable in production.
Yeah, so I don't know if you have any comments on this, Matt, but I know that there was some talk about it, but then I think people's main issue is like, oh, it's not going to be as performant, so let's just like side table that. However, with this talk about how you would schedule different like runtimes and stuff like that, so if you have like longer running Whisk actions and stuff, I can totally see coming back to this and being like, hey, this is a great use case.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that we're behind a lot of pull requests. I think that what we should always do is capture this and record it in our wiki, and then at the appropriate time, raise awareness to the dev list. And at the appropriate time, I think we really need to make note of what our priorities are for PRs. I think we all agree that the SPI PR would be top of the list, and hearing you talk about log grabbing and monitoring and stuff like that, that'd be a blessing. So just record it and put it on the wiki and raise awareness, and so it doesn't get lost.
Cool.
And I would actually say, we know that this is probably after these things. Acknowledge that, and saying, these things help us get there. I think it's, we just to make sure that, I know that we talked this morning about making sure that this new console thing goes through and doesn't, get languish out there for weeks. So we need to make sure that, if everyone here is able to build, run using the images you've built, then we need to have people, the community, acknowledge that on that PR. I mean, if Ben or Kube or something like that can say, hey, I tried this and it works, that'd be great.
Cool.
Yeah, and I haven't, to be fair, Dan, I haven't tried the latest set of changes you've made with your newest images. We've got, we have our own set of images we're publishing right now on our own branch, specifically because we're trying to get talking to the Kubernetes API. That means we have to publish our own OpenWhisk images anyway. So
right.
I need to rebase. Like, we're not always up to date with the latest master of either what you're doing or what OpenWhisk is doing. So,
here's a thought, Ben. I mean, this is something that I know that some people have been resistant to on our project, but I'm all for feature branches. I mean, if we can have the discussion and you say you have this working, can I put this out in a feature branch with the changes so people can look at it? That'd be great too.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to.
There's no reason we shouldn't have feature branches. That's just kind of like a decision that was made, and that needs to be revisited.
Okay. Yeah. Right now we keep all of our stuff just in our own fork on GitHub, but I'm happy to push it to a branch of a canonical repo instead.
I know Carlos is for it. I'm for it, and I think other people need to be convinced. So we don't want people going off working on their own forks. It's counterproductive, to all our efforts.
Well, and the goal is to push it back upstream, but we're not at a point where we feel comfortable doing that yet.
Well, I mean, it's just even for such a discussion, not to say they'll have any spare cycles, but Jeremiah or Marcus might start taking a look at it. I think those are the people who are doing our production stuff day to day, and if they see a value from it or they see simplification or whatever, then and Marcus is the guy working on performance, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. All right. Anything else?
Yeah, so it looks like this particular task is kind of done, I guess. Kube deployment, anything else is left to be addressed?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, at least most of this stuff from the first phase, at least, has been proven out. Now, right, it's the matter of getting stuff in. There's a couple other things that were left. For example, the controller, when it comes up, if it doesn't connect to the database immediately, it's very unhappy, and the process just exits, I believe. So there's some other things to do, like retries and stuff like that, to just have the system be more resilient. I think I've captured them on the GitHub issues and everything that was posted.
This is the HA controller stuff, or?
No, this isn't for HA controller. This is just for right now, if you were to put everything in one giant YAML, right? Because right now it's split, but if you could essentially put everything in one giant YAML and be like, deploy OpenWhisk for me with absolutely everything. Stuff will keep failing and then coming up. But ideally, it would be nice to have things not fail and just have the retry logic built into the actual process rather than have the container be killed and restarted. So there's some work to be done there.
Right, and we do have in our fork right now a giant YAML, but we work around this by putting in the start scripts of the various components. Wait until the controller has a place where it just waits until couch is up, which is not ideal. I mean, ideally Kubernetes would have a way to specify these kind of dependencies, but they don't. It's an open PR for them or open issue.
Yeah. The way I solved it is I put like health checks on the processes.
Right.
and so it'll notice that it's not responding, and so it'll kill the process and just try and spin up a new one, and it'll keep doing that until it eventually succeeds, which isn't great.
No, but that's definitely a more canonical way, and that's good. I saw that you had some liveness probes and readiness probes, and we should kind of. So what was your name again on the call? She was asking about
It's Kavita.
Oh, I'm Kavita.
Kavita. When you were asking about if it's kind of done, there's a lot of these things that fleshing out of the liveness and readiness probes to make deployment more robust. Of course, there's the whole can of worms of HA, which most people deploying on top of Kubernetes are probably doing so because they want HA, right? So we've got to have Zookeeper clusters, Kafka clusters, multiple controllers, multiple invokers, those kind of things. So there's a lot of that kind of fine tuning of things that still needs to be done. For sure.
I was wondering if there is any, some kind of like a portal, similar to maybe, for example, Chromium browser call traces or something. I think all the log files are JSON files anyway, right? So, something that can take the JSON files and maybe show the status in, red dot, blue dot, or whatever. Is there any tool like that somebody is working on, or is something like that is available that looks at basically the Kube logs and puts this data visually?
You mean a tool that specifically just looks at the Kubernetes log output?
Yes, for all these components, and whenever we have these kind of retry mechanisms, right? If there is a basically console kind of thing, visually, that helps you see what's happening with the system, instead of like going back and looking at the logs to see the reason for failure or retries. I'm just curious if anybody is working on a tool like that, or is there a tool available like that?
I'm trying to think of open source. I know some companies such as Red Hat have UIs and toolings and browser consoles that are based like OpenShift on top of Kubernetes, and so you've got a UI and a console there to see Kubernetes events and stuff in a browser. But I don't know if there's just a generic vanilla Kubernetes. There probably is a project, but I'm not aware of it, to visualize essentially the Kubernetes. So you want to visualize the status of the components of the deployment, basically.
Exactly, yeah. Basically, a snapshot of the deployment. If something goes down, or how many retries, and basically that shows all the links with the IP addresses and port numbers and everything. Yeah, I was just curious because I was looking at the logs for something, and looks like everything is in JSON anyway. If that is the case, just putting a chart, like a JavaScript chart, that shows the visualization, maybe conducive. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with anything like that. I haven't done like too much, or really any production level like deployments of Kubernetes and doing all this monitoring.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Once again.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious to. So all the scripts that you were showing, they're all literally on the GitHub. I can pull them in this weekend and try.
Yeah, I have a couple more PRs that I can make. I wasn't sure if I wanted to submit them because I've kind of diverted because the couple of pull requests that are being worked on technically aren't in the main repo, but they are being worked on. So I'll submit the rest of my stuff to get it in, so that you could pull it down and use it.
Okay.
Were you going to say something, Ben?
No, I was just gonna say there's nothing else from me.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was really helpful. I think having these kind of bi-weekly calls.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Bye.
Bye.